On July 5th, 2025, Palestine Action was proscribed a terrorist organization in the UK, making it illegal to support or be a member of the group. Since then, 700 arrests have been made related to demonstrations and public support, including 60 individuals currently being prosecuted. Huda Ammori, co-founder of Palestine Action, has been granted permission by the High Court to challenge the Home Secretary's decision to proscribe the group under anti-terrorism legislation. The full judicial review is scheduled for November 2025. Hi, I'm Ileana Chan, usually the co-host of Global Majority for Peace, but this week we're doing something a little different. We are currently on hiatus for our podcast, but we will be back with brand new episodes in September, starting with the amazing Carlos Martinez from Friends of Socialist China, so please tune back then. But in the meantime, this week, I wanted to share with you an interview I did with Huda Ammori, the co-founder of Palestine Action. I did this interview a few years ago before October 7th on a different podcast with a slightly different focus and different format. But nevertheless, it was a really interesting, I think insightful interview into why Huda started Pal Action, what the aims were, what the hopes were, and what it really means to be an activist in this political climate. So I hope you enjoy this interview, and please tell me in the comments what you think. But thank you for tuning in. As always, you can support us by becoming a patron on Patreon. You can become a free patron on Patreon, but we just want to diversify platforms so we don't lose all our audience if anything happens to this YouTube channel. So please become a patron. Also, if you'd like to donate to us, we have many links. They're all in the description. And either way, we really appreciate all the support that we've been getting. So thank you so much for watching, and please share, comment, like, etc. You know the drill. I hope you enjoy this interview. See you next week.
Political process is dead. It is dead. You know, like we cannot put ourselves through trying to appeal to those people anymore, to the government and the politicians, because we've seen the closest we got was completely taken away. And that's what pushed Palestine Action along. We're doing this to shut down these factories, and we will take the consequences, because for us, it's incomparable to what people who are on the other end of these weapons have to face. But at the same time, through that process, we're exposing the hypocrisy of the state and of how companies like Elbit are not being investigated for the crimes and the war crimes they commit, but the activists who try and stop them, who throw pain rather than spill blood, are the ones on trial. You don't need everyone to come along with you. You just need enough people to be committed to that change.
Hi, this is the Ignoramus Guide. I'm your host, Ileana Chan, and I'm here with a very special guest, Huda Ammori of at Pal_Action, the Direct Action Palestinian Action Group. Did I even say that correctly?
Palestine Action.
Palestine Action, Direct Action Group. So you're half Iraqi, half Palestinian. Is that how you got to, what sort of politicized you and made you come up with this Direct Action Group?
So I think growing up with Palestinian and Iraqi background definitely politicized me as a child. I think it's hard not to be in a family like that. I think I was always very aware of what was happening in Palestine and Iraq, and also the role that Britain, the country I grew up, played in that. But I wasn't necessarily an activist, I wouldn't say. I was politically aware, but I wasn't necessarily politically active. I would go, I'd go to all the big demos with my family. But it was only really when I was, I think 20, 21, and I saw what was happening in Syria and the refugee crisis, as they called it, in Europe. And it was around then that I decided, kind of on a whim, that I would go out to Lesbos, where all of the refugees were entering after fleeing and leaving from Turkey, basically, to come to Europe. And I'd raised a lot of money online in that week, and I didn't really have a plan. I just knew that I wanted to try and do what I could to help, because I was shocked at what I was seeing on the news. And when I got there, I saw thousands of people coming in every night, and they'd come in on these dinghy boats. And I expected some sort of massive response from organizations and a lot of help available for these people. And I was shocked when I got there to see that that wasn't really in place. In fact, the UNHCR was basically, they would clock off at 2 a.m. So there was, and this is when most of the people would come in. And so straight away I threw myself into trying to help people as much as I could. And there was people who were coming in suffering from hypothermia. I had to try and help people, and I wasn't a doctor or anything, but my mum was a doctor, so I'd be calling her and she'd be on the phone telling me what to do in this situation. And I remember just seeing all these, seeing what was happening and so many different events at that time, and realizing that I was helping, a few families with the money that I had to be able to get through to their journey, but that this was like a symptom of a much deeper issue, one that looped back to where I lived, which was Britain. And I remember, seeing these people and not seeing any difference between them and me, except that I had a British passport. There was one specific night, actually, I remember quite well, when basically when they would come in from Turkey, they would have to queue and they'd have to get papers from this island, this Greek island, Lesbos, in order to go on to mainland Athens, mainland Greece. And at that place, which was called Maria Camp, people were only supposed to stay there for one night. And there were people queuing throughout the night to get these papers so they could move on to the next journey. And there was probably about 1,000 people in the queue, and it was probably around 2, 3 a.m. Someone came running up to me and saying, you have to help get these people into an orderly line. And so when I went down there, basically the Greek police were shouting and screaming at people who didn't necessarily speak Greek. I didn't speak Greek, most people don't speak Greek if you're not from Greece. And they were saying, if these people don't get in an orderly line within 15, 20 minutes, we're going to start beating everyone up. And they were as cold and frank as that. And so I was rushing, and, because I could speak Arabic, to try and get these people into a line. And then within 5-10 minutes, someone came and they had the child in their arms who was unconscious. And I thought they were dead. So I ended up running around this camp trying to find a doctor, whilst having in my head that these people are going to start being beaten up. And there was hardly any volunteers on the camp at the time. Eventually they found a doctor and the child was okay. But I remember at the end of that night, I just broke down, and I was, a mess for a few hours, and I was just in disbelief of humanity, and how, how people were being treated in Europe after fleeing wars created mostly by Europe and Western countries, and the lack of regards for other human beings. And I think, and then I remember that night just thinking, that this isn't enough, that charity work and etc. is necessary only because what happens in politics requires it to be necessary, right? And then actually it's the root cause that you have to tackle. And then there, I think that moment politicized me, and then at that point it was impossible to just return to a normal life, or just going by your day to day and brushing out these issues from your head, because people's lives are at stake all of the time.
That's an amazing story, and such a better answer that I could have imagined, considering how much I bungled the question, which really minimized, I think, your achievements, just to say like, oh, you Israeli, I mean, not Israeli, Palestinian, Iraqi, and hence, of course, of course you're an activist and you've achieved so much with this. It was a ridiculous question, really, because what you've done, I think, with Palestine Action is unprecedented in the UK, isn't it? We haven't really seen anything like that. Can you speak about how it was formed and what your idea was, and a little bit about, because it was only formed 2 years ago, so could you give us a little history and how it started and what's happening now?
Yeah, definitely. So personally for myself, so from that moment on, I got involved in student campaigning. I was a student at the time, and I was searching about my university and Israel and what links they had. And I was just Googling one night, as most people do. And I found that they were investing basically millions of pounds into this company, Caterpillar, who supply the Israeli army with bulldozers, which are weaponized and used to demolish Palestinian homes and communities. And again, I was pretty annoyed at that, I don't think we should be paying student fees anyway, but we're forced to pay student fees towards an institution, and then realizing that your student fees, your money is going towards the destruction of your own people's homes in Palestine. And so I became very involved and set up a group in my university, and I would go around other universities and eventually created some sort of database which showed which university invested in what companies. And the ironic thing about all of this was that I would get the university's investment policy, which said, oh, you're not supposed to invest in companies which are complicit in human rights abuses, right? So I was like, well, this should be easy. I'll just show the evidence of how this is complicit in human rights abuses and violations of international law. And it wasn't that easy. We had to build a whole full-blown campaign. And I was trying to do similar things and help other students at other universities to tackle this complicity. And I think at that point is when it really opened my eyes to how complicit Britain was, not just through our government, but through all of our institutions in Israel's apartheid regime and the colonization of Palestine. And eventually, after I left university, I got a job at an NGO which was doing work on Palestine, and I'd taken it to a whole new level of coordinating national campaigns around divestment, for example, getting HSBC to divest from Israeli arms companies and other campaigns like that. And at the same time, I also lobbied a lot of MPs, and I did I did all of it basically, in terms of what the democratic process says is your route to change, right? And it wasn't just me, there was hundreds, if not thousands of others trying the same routes to get change. And it was actually around, and then I became quite involved in the Labour politics things under Corbyn. And that was quite a changing moment, specifically when it was on the 2019 manifesto, there was a policy for an arms embargo between Britain and Israel, which meant everything, because that meant that would be the first Western country to actually sanction Israel and not allow us to be part of, complicit in the genocide of Palestinians. And then that obviously didn't work. We all know what happened in 2019. Corbyn lost massively. A lot had to do with political backstabbing and deliberately making sure that policies like that could not happen. And I think it was shortly after that myself and others, for different motivations, realized that if we wanted change and if we wanted an arms embargo, that we would have to do it ourselves, and that the only option that was left, the only viable option, was direct action. And so that's when we decided to launch Palestine Action in July 2020, and that was targeting Albert Systems, which I can explain a bit more about, which is Israel's largest arms firm. And yeah, for us, I mean, it started off with just a few of us who were just determined that we could build a movement like this that was in solidarity with Palestinians, that was targeting complicity and targeting imperialism. And I think you are right in the sense it was unprecedented, and a lot of people may have thought that even though we'd seen things like Extinction Rebellion, become really big, right? There was thousands of people risking arrest, right, for the environment.
But my ignorance with that one, it's like I wasn't clear on what they achieved. So I think that's my question about them. Whereas I think, I don't know. Do you know anything that they do? I was about that.
I think people often try and like conflate the two, because they see like, oh, arrest for this, arrest for that. But it is quite different, our approach. So Extinction Rebellion's approach was, mass disruption, but it was still appealing to the government, right? It was finding a pressure point for the government in order to get their demands. Whereas for us, we've completely given up on that idea of appealing to this government or any other government, because they're essentially the oppressors for Palestinians, right? They've been embedded in this situation for a very long time. And so for us, we go directly to these companies and disrupt the companies from operating in the arms factories in order to shut them down and bypass the government. But I think what Extinction Rebellion did, because it launched before us, I think it normalized this idea of risking your liberty for something that's greater than yourself. And a lot of people thought when they saw Extinction Rebellion, well, yes, people do that because it's the environment, and there's a lot of this narrative around saving your own grandkids, and a little bit of like you're doing it to preserve yourselves and the people around you, right? There was a lot of the narrative. Whereas, why would people do that for people that are in another country, or a country that we've colonized or whatever? But that's just not the case. People are understand, I think, more and more that, and I think that's why what we did was unprecedented, because it was sustained direct action at arms companies that were complicit in the colonization of Palestine, and going for it day after day, week after week, to the point where they can't operate anymore. And so when we started, it wasn't necessarily like we knew exactly what was going to happen. It was just that, but we knew what we wanted to happen, right? We wanted to shut this company down. And so we went to the headquarters at first, and it was just myself and a few others. And we'd I got cardboard and cut it out at home. It was a really crap stencil and some paint. And we just walked into the headquarters, threw paint and spray painted, and got someone to video it. And it went really far. And then we just kept doing the same action over and over again. And then people were watching and going, I want to do this. And it was like people were waiting for something where they could really show that solidarity. And I think people wanted to be part of something they saw could be effective. You could see the direct result of it. And I think that's what I think when I started doing direct action, and I felt, you don't do it for yourself, but you do feel empowered, right? You do feel liberated, because it's no longer having to like ask someone else or persuade someone else and then always hitting a brick wall. It was just like, I'll just do it. I'll just go in and I'll shut this place down, you know?
Yeah. And I think there is I mean, because I think when we're talking about it being unprecedented, like some people might, who are not familiar with the case, might be like, there are people who chain themselves to things. And yes, there are courageous people that do put themselves in harm's way for the greater good, etc. But I think what you specifically did so cleverly and effectively was actually going after this specific company, which you mentioned, but like just to reiterate, you went after this specific company. You affected essentially the business stability of the company, making it hard for them to operate, making it therefore hard for them to maintain their like offices here in the UK, right? And so it sort of affected, unfortunately, in a capitalistic system, affected their bottom line, and that's why it was so effective. Um, what is happening now with the factory and I think were there three factories or?
Yeah, so I could explain a bit about Albert in general, and where they are today. So I think, and you are exactly right, like in terms of how these companies operate, you know, capitalism works that profits come before everything else, right? And in order to affect those companies, you have to harm their bottom line, because that is the only language they speak. And so Elbit is actually, so it's Israel's largest arms firm, and they were actually formed in 1966. And basically they were formed in Israel, and their sole purpose was, at the time, was to arm the militia in order to ethnically cleanse the indigenous population of Palestine. It was actually just a year after they were formed that my own family was forced out with brutal force, with bullets probably made by this company. And they actually market their weapons as as battle tested, because Gaza, which is one of the most densely populated areas on earth, people are literally trapped there. It's been described as the world's largest open air prison, because people can't leave and people can't enter. And majority of the population there are children and refugees who've already been displaced from other parts of Palestine. So you have these people who are captive, a captive population in Gaza, Palestinians, who routinely bombarded by Israel, attacked. They have their, you know, schools, hospitals, their infrastructure, their only power plant is routinely destroyed by missiles, attacks, and drones that are made by Elbit Systems. And they use this every time. I mean, people often hear about Palestine only when you have a really intense bombardment, right? But it's happening all of the time. It's just not shown in the news. But they never talk about the fact that it's companies like Elbit who are using these attacks as opportunities to test their weapons out. It's sickening, I know. And so then they actually market them all as battle tested or combat proven. And then they sell them on to other oppressive regimes across the world. So basically, if Palestine wasn't illegally occupied and colonized, then Elbit wouldn't exist. So their whole business model is based on the destruction of Palestine, and then using this to show other oppressive regimes, look how great we've killed the Palestinians, you can use these weapons in your place. But not only are they making these drones, which is kind of one of the things they're infamous for. These drones are not only used to attack and kill Palestinians, which they've been used a lot to do, but they are surveilling people all of the time, especially in Gaza. So if you're a Palestinian in Gaza, they literally will talk about the sound of these drones all of the time above their heads. And so you can imagine, if you have a weapon that's been used to destroy your neighbors or your family, and the same weapon is above you all of the time. And this is how Elbit's kind of like their main this is, you know, this is kind of what they do over the people in Gaza. But in addition, and that got worse actually. In May 2021, there was a very heavy bombardment of Gaza. In the space of, I think it was 11 days, they killed hundreds of Palestinians. And they started to use artificial intelligence drones for the first time, and it was swarms of drones. So normally you have one drone, one soldier, someone very far away who's just behind a computer screen and gets to, you know, decide who lives or dies. And often they kill civilians. And then now they've made it so you have swarms of drones, which are mostly autonomous, and they only require one person for this whole swarm of drones to operate it. Sure. And they were using this in May, and they called it, the military said, this is the world's first artificial intelligence war. And Elbit at that time weren't even just supplying these weapons. An Israeli general had said that they were sitting alongside them, conducting the strikes. So this is a private arms manufacturer conducting these strikes with the military. And even people, you know, in the arms industry were going, this is too far. But now the British Ministry of Defence has now bought these drones right after they were used in Gaza. So it's just, I mean, in terms of like the, but in addition to that, you have things like the apartheid wall. So Israel built an apartheid wall in Palestine and West Bank. And what they did was, it was basically to keep Palestinians captive, and at the same time, use it as a way of stealing more land from the Palestinians, because they would just build this wall through Palestinian villages and, you know, say, that's it, your Palestinian village is gone, you're not in the wall. And so Albert built a lot of technology for this wall. And then the same technology is now being used for Trump's wall between the US and Mexico. And the same drones that were used in Gaza are now being used to stop and surveil refugees who are trying to seek refuge in Britain and Europe and other places. So like, it's very clear that Palestine is often used as a laboratory of how you can oppress a whole population, and then they're sent to other places. So in Britain specifically, when we started, they had 10 sites, 5 factories, 2 headquarters. You know, you think you'd only need 1, but they had 2, one in London, one in Bristol. And then they were operating out of 3 Royal Air Force bases where they were training British military, British soldiers. And so when we started, there was 10. And we were targeting the London headquarters at first, for the first few weeks. And actually, there was a meeting almost straight away between the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs, Israel's Defense Minister, and Dominic Raab, who was Foreign Secretary of Britain. And Israel basically said, you have to crush this movement, you have to crush Palestine Action. And when we saw that, we were like, okay, we're doing the right thing here. You know, I've never seen a kind of response that strong so quickly into it. And I think they understood, if people no longer had this obstacle of appealing to the government, that we are able to lobby, etc., then we can't stop this. And I think that's what was so powerful about direct action. But we also went out to the factories. So they're often in odd places like Staffordshire or the north of England. And the factory in Oldham was in a place where there was a high Kashmiri population, there was a high Asian population. Kashmir is occupied, and they often use Albert's weapons against the occupied people of Kashmir. So the locals were up in arms about this factory being there. And after about a year and a half of taking direct action at the site, there was a kind of campaign beforehand, but it didn't really have much direct action involved. And so there was sustained direct action. And then in January this year, it closed down, and they said that basically they sold it off at a massive loss. They sold it for 9 million after buying it for 15 million 10 years before. And so that was an extraordinary achievement, that one of these factories was forced to go, and it was really under, you know, quite intense actions, like people doing lock-ons to shut them down, you know, blocking the front door so they couldn't go to work, to people climbing onto the roof and damaging the infrastructure. Just to two Kashmiris, locals, went inside and just destroyed all of their machinery. And it became pretty clear that even though they were investing so much in security and they had the police surveilling the site, they couldn't stop people from doing it, from taking action. And it became too much for them, and then they left. And so that was, you know, I think that was an extraordinary achievement, and we didn't realize that we were necessarily going to get that kind of success so quickly. And then just a few months ago in London, again, it was targeted regularly, but for 6 weeks there was kind of a focus on that site of people taking action once or twice a week, quite simple, you know, just people in these in these tubes and locked onto each other, blocking the front doors and throwing paint over the building, twice a week, constantly for 6 weeks. And eventually they had to leave and had to abandon their London headquarters. So it's definitely working.
How do, because the first thing, maybe because I've lived in the States for so long, the first thing I'm thinking is like the police coming in and like shooting everyone, or I guess here just I mean arresting everybody, or you know. So how did you have to deal with that sort of thing, like arrests and being charged and things like that?
Yeah, we definitely dealt with a lot of that. No shooting from them, thankfully. Actually, it's not that funny, but when I was on the roof of one of the factories in Shenstone, my mum was like, "They're gonna shoot you, Huda." And I don't know, Mum, it's not Iraq, it's okay. She was okay in the end. But actually, I mean, we know when we're taking this type of action that we do it to shut down these factories, and we're willing to take the consequences. And often that does mean arrest, although there are people who take action covertly at complicit companies and don't necessarily risk arrest every time. But what we saw at the start was we were getting arrested quite routinely, and they were raiding our homes quite a lot. And actually for myself and Richard, I think there was a concerted effort at the start of the movement to try and intimidate us as much as possible. And I think it was a tactic, because while you're still growing and relatively small, then, you know, they can get away with a lot more. Whereas when you build a platform, it's more difficult for them to do that kind of, use those kind of tactics. So pretty quickly after we did this action on the rooftop of one of the factories, where we were there for 3 days and we destroyed the place basically, and they had put a camera, the police had put a camera in a primary school opposite where we lived, facing our front door. And then it was noticed by a friend of ours who was a filmmaker, who said, "Have you seen that camera there? That's not a normal camera." And so I called the school and I said, you know, "What's this camera doing pointing at our front door?" And they said, "Oh, the one the police came and put up." And then quickly they were passing it on to someone else, and I said, "Oh, we can't talk about that." Quickly changed their tune. And then we were stopped by counter-terrorism. So it's Schedule 7 counter-terrorism legislation. Basically, if you travel to any, like if you're on any ports or airports, they have this legislation where they can stop you under this legislation. And it means you have no right to no comment, you don't have a right to a solicitor, you have to give all your passwords over, whatever else. And so we were stopped under that and interrogated for, this was quite early on in Palestine Action, for about 3 or 4 hours and then arrested for refusing to give over my laptop password, and because we had a stencil. I mean, it was ridiculous. Like and that was like, yeah, we had a stencil with us, and like it was literally just like, and they were like, oh, you were obviously on the way to an action. And I was like, no, we weren't. We were traveling. You know what I mean? Like, if we're going to go do an action, are we really going to take all of our bags and everything with us? You know?
You bring your spray can with you while traveling. Like,
I don't even think there was a spray can. It was just a stencil, and like we had the t-shirts and like other things.
The idea of that, like you have to bring all your equipment, including, you know, everything that would implicate you.
yeah. I was like, please give us a break. We won't do that. But yeah, I mean, it was ironic because it's like, this is counter-terrorism, and they're arresting you for having a stencil on you. Oh God. But like they were very like obvious. Like it was both me and Richard. So we were separated straight away, and then they told Richard straight away, you know why you're here, because of Palestine Action. They told me an hour in, because I was still like, okay, maybe it was just a random stop, you know. We were just hoping in my head it was just a random stop or whatever. And then I quickly realized,
I've been randomly stopped before.
You've never been randomly stopped?
I don't
think there is such a thing as random stops. I don't think it exists.
I find that. Yeah, I don't think. Where would they get the time to randomly stop and also purposefully stop? That's like a lot of stopping, you know. Yeah. But okay, but you.
Well, I think because when I travel with my brothers and stuff, especially because, you know, my brother was born in Iraq, and we'd always get randomly stopped. Yeah, so I don't think it was random, you know. But like that's what they say to you. You know, oh, random, the only brown people in the queue get stopped, you know. It's like it stops being random when it happens every time, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then after that, shortly after that, we had raids and where we lived. It was like they raided it twice in one day, and they arrested Richard for blackmail.
What?
Which was shocking. And then during this process of arresting Richard for blackmail, of what was clearly a sellout, because, you know, he went out for a run, and then the police officers said, oh, stop or something, and he didn't stop. He just kept running, and he went home. And then they were like, oh, locking on, and they tried to make it look like it was just a random coincidence. And then suddenly there's all these plainclothes officers around the back of this church where we were staying. And anyway, and then they took my passport, even though I wasn't under arrest. I eventually got it back a few months later. But in general, like, I mean, that was a period of time when they were really kind of throwing the book at us, so to speak. But a lot of people, like, when you do an action, does end up in arrest a lot of the time, mostly because the aim is often to occupy a site for as long as possible. So if you're occupying a factory or an office, then often people stay there until they're forcibly removed. And it's this idea of resist till the very end, you know, and then you'll have to force us to reopen this place. We won't, you know, you're not going to take us that easily. So often it does lead to arrests, and then sometimes people get charged, sometimes they don't. And then we fight it through the courts. But that's a whole other element to it, because it's kind of like the action doesn't stop at the action. Often it continues throughout the trial process, throughout pushing for disclosure and fighting to prove Elbit is guilty, basically in the courts as well as at their factories.
Oh, I see. So that's actually considered part of the action, is what happens in the trials, and what information you can disclose during that time, and what media coverage you can get in the trials. Okay, yeah. So do you have, like, usually when I think about these types of actions too, I think of maybe legal organizations like the ACLU, you know, like in the US, but nowadays I think of a lot of those organizations as compromised. So is that something that you have, like, do you have organizations behind you in terms of when you're fighting legal action, stuff like that?
Well, we have got quite a lot of support from, I would say, most of, grassroots groups and individuals. For us in Palestine Action, like, it's key that, like, every court date, from a plea hearing to just a boring hearing about the admin stuff of the trial, there's always support outside, and protest outside as well, because for us it's like you said, there is the media coverage element, but there's also the element that we're doing this to shut down these factories, and we will take the consequences, because for us it's incomparable to what people who are on the other end of these weapons have to face. But at the same time, through that process, we're exposing the hypocrisy of this state, and of how companies like Elbit are not being investigated for the crimes, the war crimes they commit, but the activists who try and stop them, who throw paint rather than spill blood, are the ones on trial. But just to give a little bit of history, so before Palestine Action, there was different actions and against Elbit. It wasn't as sustained and it wasn't as disruptive, but every time no one would go to trial. And it became very clear that if you took action against Elbit, you weren't going to court, because they didn't want it to go to court. They didn't, when people would ask for things like disclosure, cases would get dropped. But when Palestine Action launched, it kind of forced them into this dilemma of, well, if you don't take them to court, they're just going to destroy our factories and we won't have anything left. But if you do take them to the court and lose, then we have no legal protection in this country either, because juries or whatever are acquitting people. And even if they do find us guilty, right, as long as we know that history is going to vindicate us, and you stay resolute in that. But what's happened so far is that in the trials, the first trial, people were found not guilty. We've had a number of trials now, 90% of which have actually been acquitted in those trials. But in terms of organisation support, like, I'd say we find most of our base of support in the grassroots, and NGOs haven't been the most helpful in that kind of support. But I think we find our own mechanisms within Palestine Action to provide that support, and we have amazing lawyers, right? They are, Kelly solicitors who work on nearly every case, and they are brilliant at maintaining that support and fighting our case and producing reports on Elbit systems. They're basically experts in Palestine Action right now, so they are. So we have that. But I think in terms of like those NGO type figures, we're seeing a bit more support now. But when we launched Palestine Action, and for the first 2 years, which is the majority of the time we've existed, a lot of NGOs were very quiet about us. And I think it was, and I think when something new comes along and is quite radical, and is achieving things, then it's the complete opposite to the kind of like, let's set up an organization where we're going to be doing this for tens of years, and there's not necessarily that same urgency, or that same, and I think to become like an established organization as well, you kind of you give up a lot of that kind of like idea of radical activism, because you want to keep your status, so you don't want to whatever, you're staying comfortable
as well, like your tax-free status or whatever. It's probably something like that. And it also kind of, it's just ironic as you're talking, it makes me realize, like, here in the UK, they've kind of made protesting illegal. They've made like us just I actually want to talk to you about the Al Jazeera documentary on the labor files, but they've made it so that we're looking electorally like there's no point in voting, it feels like, although I do want to talk to you again about the Green Party. I saw some of your tweets, but direct action seems to be like the most logical step, because if they're going to take away things like peaceful protests, like it's kind of pointless. I mean, not peaceful protests, but protests that cause disruption are illegal. So now it's like, and and voting for politicians are pointless if they're all bought over by all these huge corporations. Then how do we affect change? And it's like, this does seem to be, I was reading an article that you tweeted in the Investment Monitor, and I thought it was really interesting because I'm assuming it's some sort of financial magazine, I don't know, but it talks about that. It talks about the way in which it's kind of starting. What is the word? That's not like a platitude, but it's not trend, but like you can see how you mentioned in the article that people in the US are also talking to you about how did you do this and how can we replicate it in the US. So it just seems like a logical step. And I mean, what is your advice to people in the US? Because it's slightly different there, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is like I think when people see Palestine Action in Britain, they might think that there's some myth that actually that the consequences just aren't that great, or it's easier to do it here. And to a certain level, it's different in every single region, right? But we are, I mean, I think it's already a fascist state. I think it has been for a long time, especially when it comes to like imperialism and other things around those issues. But like, you're right, when you start seeing protests becoming illegal and basic things like you can't have noise at protest or whatever, then in a sense it's it's scary to see the trend. But at the same time, it's like, well, if you leave, there's no other option. And if people are facing arrest for doing a protest, then why don't we just shut down an arms factory and lock on? It's like they've left you, and it's the same risk.
In fact, like the way that you're talking about the strategy, you're more likely to get charged and put in prison maybe for a protest right now than actual action against a company that does not want to disclose documents. So
yeah,
that's kind of the irony of this. I mean, obviously you are sacrificing quite a bit here. Let's not minimize that. But I think there is some irony in that as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's almost like, and I think when they put in these type of laws, that these repressive laws, it does end up in a backlash where people become more radicalized by it, and more understanding of, okay, this is the situation. There's no longer this facade of this democratic civilized society, right? You take away rights to protest, people are becoming more aware of these companies and how they operate, and the role Britain plays in the world, which is not a very good one, and it ends up actually making our movement stronger, even if the effect is to do the opposite, because people become a bit more resilient throughout the process. But I think, like, in terms of internationally, I think the same principles of direct action, of picking a target, and I think you mentioned this before, I think the power of a single target in a world where there are so many evil companies out there, and so many companies which are complicit in all of in oppression, that having a single target is good, because you're focusing your resources into one thing, and it's geared towards winning. And I think for movements, we need successes in order to keep going and to keep growing, right? And to build momentum as well. And through one target, you end up sending a message to every other company. If you also profit from the genocide of the Palestinians, or the people of Yemen, or people of Kashmir, then this could happen to you. And it starts to change how companies, the risk they're willing to take, because, as we said, they only care about profits. And and I think someone said this as well, about how Palestine Action is making, I like to say, a hostile environment for arms companies, in Britain, which obviously is used often for against migrants and refugees, but it's like we should be making it, we are the majority. And I think that we actually have so much in our favor when it comes towards people who understand these issues, and that you don't necessarily, if you're in America or I don't know, Denmark or wherever, you don't need everyone to come along with you. You just need enough people to be committed to that change, right? Like people still called Nelson Mandela a terrorist, you know, just before he was released. It wasn't that everyone had to be won over. It was just that enough people had to take that concrete, committed action in order to create that change. And I think that's the power of direct action, is that, you know, it's an alliance of the willing. And if you're willing to do it, then go for it. And I think in terms of like tactics, like, you know, if you're in the US, maybe you don't start with, I don't know, going inside and smashing up all of the weapons, unless you are willing to take on the consequence of what that would lead to in terms of a potential sentence. But I think you have to get that line just right, where you have a variety of things that can bring people on board, but it's possible to get on the roof and stay there, or to lie in front of the front doors and blockade a factory, and you might be facing something a lot lower in terms of the risk. So I think it's something that you can play with wherever you are, but the principles still apply. And I think there was a relatively new group in America. Don't know what it stands for, but it's called RAM Inc. I think it's against the military industrial complex, and they've done a couple of actions that have been people getting on the roof of the Raytheon factory in, I don't know what these places are called in America, I think Cambridge, and interrupted a meeting with a war criminal there. And so there is some stuff happening there.
I saw that. It was a video. A Raytheon representative was speaking at a university. Is that the group? And they came in and disrupted her lecture.
Yeah. I thought it was brilliant. But they've also done like rooftop actions, and so it's been great to see that happening over there. And so I think there are sparks of things in different places happening in terms of anti-imperialist direct action. And you know, alongside Britain, in terms of Elbit, the US is another like hotbed, obviously, right, for Elbit systems. Australia as well, and there have been. We saw actually a couple of weeks ago there was an action at one of the Elbit sites in Australia, as well, and there's been some movement in Germany. So I think for us in Palestine Action, we do focus on where we are and put all of our energy into that. But it's nice to see that that's kind of being seen by people across the world who are doing similar things in their areas.
Oh, so it's not coordinated. It was people in Australia, people in, I think there was one in New York, wasn't there?
Yeah, there was a protest there recently.
The direct actions were taken independently. It's not like, oh, you've had a meeting over Zoom.
No, and actually, no, it was
recorded. Probably taken to the CIA. But like,
No, there was no meetings. No, there actually wasn't. It was spontaneous, and I think that's really like actually, that's when you can feel like something is. When things happen independent of initiatives, like then you're like, okay, this is happening, you know? People are saying this. And I think you don't really realize the reach you have as like Palestine Action until, they're doing it, you know, they're doing it in this place. And it's very cool to see that actually it is a concept that is growing. And I think also it just means that like whatever, when you get to that point as well, like whatever the government or the state try and do here to repress activists, then there could be a backlash internationally. And I think there's a lot of, you know, it's exciting to have a movement like that where you don't necessarily have to know everyone in it, but you know that you stand for each other, you know?
Yeah, and because it's so clear, like a lot of other movements that have been co-opted because they use, because they use language like freedom or like democracy, which we know is nebulous. They use all these key words. It's so easy for like the NED or the CIA to co-opt it, or even like Amazon to put like Black Lives Matter on the slogan, because the action, even if I believe in Black Lives Matter, it's not like you're doing a very specific, Albert, shut that down. And this is how you're doing it. It's just, I think it's so clever, and like it gives me a little bit of hope. But speaking of killing hope, I did want to go into that Al Jazeera documentary because you were involved in the first episode. At least I've only watched the first episode, so I'm assuming, is that the only one you're in?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think it's called The Crisis.
The Crisis. It's for those of you who haven't watched it, it's the labor files on Al Jazeera. It's a 3-part series, and the first part is The Crisis. And Huda, you're on it. Am I saying your name right? Huda?
Yeah.
Huda. Okay. Yeah. You're in it, and you're talking about, essentially the first episode is about how I guess like Jeremy Corbyn was defeated, and all the leftists in the Labour Party were sort of pushed out through charges of anti-Semitism. And the anti-Semitism definition in the UK was changed to include Zionism. Right. So that's essentially what that for. And it's like a when I was watching it, it's just like very disheartening how effective it was when it's so quite clearly stupid. The accusations were, had nothing to do with the anti-Semitism, was to do with Palestine. How did you get involved in that documentary? What was your experience with that, and your whole involvement with labor, essentially?
Yeah, I think I only played it's just a small part, where I was approached by the filmmaker actually 2 years prior to when eventually it was recorded. But I think it was kind of in the making for a long time. And I think they were looking for, I think because of my experience, I was involved with Labour mostly because I saw an opportunity which I've never thought existed in British politics before, and that was Corbyn's era, or however you like to call it. And it's specifically that actually there was room to talk about Palestine, and there was room to advance policies which were going to support the people of Palestine, and also people in Kashmir and other places. Like, it was like for the first time you felt like what should be obvious, like, anti-imperialism, and if people are, people who claim to be anti-racist and then don't acknowledge how their country's role plays in other countries against brown and black people across the world, it's like, this is, the worst forms of institutional racism in my eyes anyway. And so it's
my biggest frustration, I have to say. Yeah. Living in the States for so long, but yeah.
I know, but it's like, it's not just about having like, another lecturer who's of a person of color. It's like, it's actually much deeper than that. And I think there's a reason people co-opt these movements, right? It's often to stop the politics from going further, to what's
intangible too, because now it's more about what language you use versus what's actually happening, what's actually happened, etc.
Yeah.
So, it's easy to shut people up, which is actually, I guess, relevant to this, what you were saying about what this documentary is about, the labor files. It's so easy to shut people up with certain accusations because you don't want to be accused further.
Yeah, and I think that's what was happening, like pretty soon, like into this, like, oh great, there's all this opportunity. And I was mostly focused on the arms embargo and trying to push that through. And for me, when I saw all the anti-Semitism things happening, it was very obvious like what was happening. But at the same time, the media and the amount of attention put on showing one narrative and closing in the other one, it basically meant that the conversation started with anti-Semitism. And when you start a conversation with anti-Semitism, there was no room to talk about actually Palestine and the fact that a lot of these people are being targeted because they're anti-Zionist and they're against Palestinians being displaced from their homes and ethnically cleansed. But when they start off with those who may, be feel offended because you're talking about a political ideology that they feel associated with, rather than from a political ideology which is systematically oppressing Palestinians, that it's just all so odd. And then it leaves people like me or other Palestinians very frustrated, because it doesn't start with, okay, Zionism, for example, or let's talk about Palestine, and it was, and I picked up the sign, and it was designed that way so that Palestinians couldn't enter the debate, so that there was no room to talk about Palestine. I think I remember even at one point they were like, oh, we can't talk about Palestinians right now, we're talking about anti-Semitism. And it's like, well, that's job done, that's what they want, that's what they're trying to achieve here.
It's Zionism and anti-Semitism, but really you can't talk about Palestine. Like, what? Yeah, that's so frustrating.
But I think they did it so it's like everyone feels nervous talking about Palestine. Are you going to get accused? And then even me, as someone who, like, I've obviously anti-racist, right? And then obviously against anti-Semitism and all of those things, right? Even me, when I'm talking about my own people's oppression, have to think about every word you say, just in case they can manipulate it or whatever. So you always feel like, and now I have it in a different sense, like I have it with the police, right? But like you always feel like every word you say is like monitored and be used against you. And so it's very distracting. And it means that you just have to be like on all the time, because there are people out there who, for a political reason or for, a political reason, again, if it's the police or whatever, are going to want you to mess up so they can use it against you. Right. There's none of this is happening in good faith. It's all happening in bad faith. But I think the main thing that the whole thing was successful in, which wasn't necessarily discussed in the documentary, was that policies like the arms embargo, policies which were in solidarity with people in Yemen, an arms embargo between Britain and Saudi Arabia, were on that 2019 manifesto, and that was never enacted because there were so many political backstabbings and using of these accusations and weaponizing it to stop that from happening. And I think that's the tragedy that happened, and that was a lot of the intended outcome was to make sure that the Corbyn project couldn't be successful. And in a sense, it's also though shown that actually these things you're never really you're never going to get a moment like that in the political party anyway. And then I think it made a lot of people like myself realize that, okay, the political process is dead. It is dead. Like we cannot put ourselves through trying to appeal to those people anymore, to the government and the politicians, because we've seen the closest we got was completely taken away. And that's what pushed Palestine Action along,
Right. Yeah. And I'm inclined to agree. I've been kind of off electoral politics for a while now, but I do think while watching that documentary, I'm just like, all these people who came up and who are political for the first time because of Corbyn, and Bernie Sanders in the US, like that energy is true. That energy could be moved towards direct action, but I think it's like what you were saying, there's only a small fraction of the willing for direct action. So that means there's just like millions and millions and millions of people that want a political home. And now that I'm back in the UK, I was like looking at voting and stuff, and I wanted to vote for someone. I couldn't though, because there was nobody on the ballot to vote for. But I wanted to vote for someone, and I was like, oh, what about the Green Party? And I've not been so happy with the way the Green Party's messaging is. They just seem to be like neoliberal light or something. Maybe I'm not getting their full message, but that's what it seems like. And then you tweeted something about one of the ex Green Party leaders, I think. That's like she's actually being sponsored by Elbit right now.
Natalie Bennett.
Natalie Bennett.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I feel the same. Like there is with the Green Party, Natalie Bennett. So she's going on a minimum of 15-day trip military course where they play dress up in army uniforms, and it's sponsored by all the major arms companies, including Elbit Systems, which, like, the Green Party historically has always been quite, as you said, probably more neoliberal in their approach, right? Kind of more liberal in general, but at least they had like a strong stance on the arms trade and those kind of issues. But it feels like that even they are being co-opted and manipulated, and probably willingly. I think it gets to a point where they're just so thirsty for more power that they'll just follow what the establishment wants, because they understand that if you follow the establishment, you have a chance. But if you're anti-establishment, you end up like Corbyn, And I think there's a lot of there's no heart in any of it anymore. It all feels. Especially, I think the thing is that the issue of when this situation's happening is that there's some people who are still, really pushy on a certain issue, and so then end up negating other issues. But it's like, I think if you stand in solidarity with Palestinians, how can you vote for someone who calls himself a proud Zionist, which both Keir Starmer and Liz Truss have done, right? Like, you're literally voting in their oppressor. Like, it's the same for a lot of other issues where they might try and champion a little tiny bit on the climate, but not really, but then you're selling out.
The climate thing is really like, that is BS. You can't be for climate initiatives or like green initiatives and also for war. That is insane, because we know that, the military is like the #1 polluter, really. Especially the US military, which has no oversight, right? So it's such a huge contradiction. Essentially, I'm completely disillusioned. I was I was moved to hope talking to you, and now I brought the tone down. I brought the tone back down. And
I think the thing is that we're not alone in that, and there was a lot of other people. And actually, the bigger I think the gap becomes between people and the political process, the more room there is for actual systemic change, which isn't just superficial. So I think as well, it's about clinging on to that.
So what about stuff like enough is enough? That's sort of a new slogan / I'm not sure what it is. Is it a movement? I don't think it's a party. So it's some sort of movement that's come up this year.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not very engaged in those things. And I mean, sometimes I can't keep up either, because there's a lot of new things coming up. All with similar messaging and similar points, and I think it's great to see people mobilized and energized over issues. I think the thing I struggle with now, especially being involved in activism, is what is the theory of change? And I think people need that as well. You need to know, how are we going to get from now there's hundreds of thousands of us protesting, what's the plan? Like, right, we know that they're not going to bow down to just this. What is the long-term plan? But I think with general, the strikes happening and all of those things happening, I think those are things that have to compel change for people's wages and workers, etc. But there's still a large part of politics that doesn't cover. And often, I mean, for us or for me, that's the anti-imperialist policies are not included in that. They're not, And so in some ways, it feels like a few years ago, it was all kind of merged into one, like people who were protesting for, to be able to, against austerity, were also protesting for Palestine. But the demands of enough is enough, I think, are good in terms of domestic policies, but it's then but then the international politics are taken off, and it's like you have to in every part of politics acknowledge the role this country has played and continues to play in destroying other people's countries, and I think when that's taken out, it's just, it doesn't, I hope they get some of those demands, and benefit people, but I don't, if you're not included, you're a group of people or people across the world, then we have to, again, back to Palestine Action and just taking direct action, because
Right. Yeah, I agree. I think what's interesting about coming back to the UK is that people in the UK may be more willing to look at the US. Like if I say, oh, US war crimes and US complicity, they're more likely to recognize that. But when I turn it back to the UK, a lot of them are like, we're not as bad as the US. There's still a little bit of the denial of I mean, even though the British Empire predated, American imperialism, there's still a little bit of that denial. And you're right, like we can't, there's, like you said, I think the lessons learned from the purge of Corbynites or Corbyn is that people are siloing their concerns just in case. They only want to speak about class issues. They're scared to speak about Russia now, because once you speak about something, once you put it all together, there's like more things that you can be canceled on.
Yeah.
So essentially people like being very, very specific. And I guess that makes sense too, like for the direct action stuff, but it is a bit like, it's a little it's a little disheartening if we're looking for solidarity, essentially. But yeah. But thank you so much for this conversation. It was amazing. I actually feel very inspired, even though I had to bring it down. And do you have any like last words of wisdom or anything that you wanted to say?
Not really, just thank you. I really enjoyed doing this podcast, even if it's not all been joyful. But yeah, I just think if people are inspired by Palestine Action's doing, then you can obviously check out what we're doing on our social media. I think you mentioned at the start at pal_action, or check out our website. And if people are interested in replicating or doing something similar, then we're always happy to chat to people. But thank you for doing this podcast and for what you do in general.
Oh, thank you. I did want to say one last thing, was just you mentioned briefly before we started the podcast, where are you just legally? You were saying something like, we forgot to cover it. Just where are you legally?
So personally, I was supposed to be on trial with 7 others, facing different charges, conspiracy charges of to destroy Elbit, which is quite a fun charge to be charged under, and blackmail, which is not so fun. That's just an outlandish charge. But basically, that was supposed to happen. I was supposed to be on trial now with others for 5 to 6 weeks, and that has been postponed a year, at least a year.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So,
a good or a bad thing in your mind?
I mean, I think you could take it either way, but it happens. I'll take it as a good thing. But we do have a lot of other cases coming up in Palestine Action, and actually today people are on trial for taking action in London. So we are fighting throughout these court cases to prove that Elbit is guilty and that we are not, and that they have a lot to answer for. But we are seeing in general, there's been a recent trend that Elbit are just failing to actually build a case or to provide evidence, and are reluctant to come to court, which has led in cases being delayed or dropped altogether. So it's an ongoing battle, which we're kind of in the middle of right now. But I think our main thing in terms of solidarity with us is we use the hashtag Albert is guilty to push the message that actually it's Albert who we are dragging to court to prove that they are war criminals, and that we are innocent because we are fighting against a greater, I think it's not only just in terms of the legal world, but it's the moral thing to do, and arguably the legal thing to do. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And yeah, we know where to find you at pal_action.